In the shadows of 1960s South London, while the Kray twins basked in celebrity glamour across the Thames, a far more brutal empire was being built. An empire ruled not by charm, but by pliers, bolt cutters, and electric shocks. This is the story of Charlie Richardson, the man even the Krays feared, the gangster who turned a scrapyard into a torture chamber, and who was arrested on the most iconic day in English history. Pour yourself a drink, dim the lights, and settle in, because tonight, we're diving deep into the blood-soaked reign of Britain's most sadistic crime boss. But before we begin, I need to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. Are you winding down after a long day in New York? Is it 3 a.m. and you can't sleep in London? Let me know. And if you're a fan of true crime stories told the right way, with all the details, no shortcuts, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Give this video a like if you want more deep dive gangster documentaries. Now, let's begin. The story of Charles William Richardson begins not with violence, but with abandonment. Born on January 18, 1934, in Camberwell, South London. Some sources mention Brentford, Middlesex, but the family settled in Camberwell very early. Charlie came into a world still recovering from the Great Depression, a world where working-class families struggled to keep food on the table and hope alive in their hearts. His birth certificate recorded him as the first son of a family that would soon fracture under the weight of poverty and neglect. The Richardson family didn't stay in Brentford long. Like thousands of other working-class families seeking opportunity in the capital, they moved to Camberwell, South London, settling into the dense warren of terraced houses that characterized the area. Camberwell in the 1930s was a world unto itself, a place where neighbors knew everyone's business, where corner shops extended credit to families they'd known for generations, and where poverty wasn't shameful, but simply the common condition of life. Charlie's family grew quickly. His brother Eddie arrived in 1936, just 2 years after Charlie, and their sister Elaine completed the trio in 1940. The three children would grow up inseparable, bound together by circumstances that would have broken weaker bonds. Their mother worked tirelessly to provide for them, taking in laundry and cleaning houses for wealthier families across the river. But the defining moment of Charlie Richardson's childhood came when his father simply walked out the door one day and never came back. Abandonment by a father was not uncommon in working-class London, but it was always devastating. For young Charlie, his father's desertion planted a seed of anger that would grow throughout his life. In later years, he would speak of this betrayal with a cold fury that never quite dissipated. Even decades removed from the event, the absence of a father figure meant Charlie had to become the man of the house at an impossibly young age, responsible for his younger siblings and helping his mother survive. The timing of this abandonment was particularly cruel. Britain was sliding toward war with Nazi Germany, and by the time Charlie was 5 years old, the Blitz had begun. South London became a target for German bombers seeking to destroy the docks and industrial areas along the Thames. Night after night, the Richardson children would huddle with their mother in cramped Anderson shelters or underground stations, listening to the whistling fall of bombs and the crump of explosions that shook the earth. The war years shaped Charlie in ways that would resonate throughout his criminal career. He learned that the world was fundamentally unfair, that survival meant being tougher and smarter than those around you, and that authority, whether German bombers or British officials, cared little for the lives of people like him. The bombed-out buildings of South London became his playground, a dangerous landscape where children played among rubble and unexploded ordnance, where death was always close, but somehow never quite close enough to seem real. But war also brought opportunities. The chaos of wartime London meant that enterprising young boys could make money in ways that peacetime would never allow. Charlie and Eddie learned to scavenge valuable materials from bombed buildings, copper piping, lead from roofs, anything that could be sold to scrap merchants who asked few questions. This was Charlie's introduction to the scrap metal trade that would later provide the legitimate cover for his criminal empire. Despite the hardships, or perhaps because of them, Charlie Richardson was not a typical street urchin. He possessed a sharp intelligence that set him apart from other boys in his neighborhood. He could read and write well, and he had an almost instinctive understanding of numbers and business. While other children played, Charlie was thinking about opportunities, about how to turn the chaos around him into profit. He was also a natural athlete. In the boxing clubs that dotted South London, providing working-class boys with structure and discipline, Charlie Richardson developed into a formidable fighter. He had quick hands, good footwork, and most importantly, an absolute refusal to be intimidated in the ring. He learned lessons that would serve him well in the criminal underworld. How to read an opponent, how to exploit weakness, when to attack and when to wait, and above all, how to hurt someone efficiently and effectively. The boxing gym became Charlie's second home. The smell of sweat and leather, the rhythmic thud of fists against heavy bags, the shouted encouragement of trainers. This was where he felt most alive. His trainers saw potential in him, the kind of raw talent that could potentially lead to professional success. But Charlie had different plans. Boxing taught him discipline and violence. But he was already looking beyond the ring to larger prizes. By his teenage years, Charlie Richardson had developed the persona that would define him for life. He was quiet and calculating, not given to the loud bragging that characterized many young toughs. When he spoke, people listened. Because his words carried weight, he dressed well, understanding instinctively that appearance mattered in business, whether legitimate or otherwise, and he had already developed the cold, assessing stare that would later terrify victims and associates alike. The end of World War II in 1945 brought new opportunities for young men with ambition and few scruples. Post-war Britain was awash in military surplus, abandoned equipment, and the detritus of 6 years of total war across the country. Military airfields were being decommissioned, their contents either officially disposed of or, more often, left to rust and rot. For Charlie Richardson, these abandoned bases represented the opportunity of a lifetime. By age 16, Charlie had left school and was working full-time in the scrap metal trade. But he wasn't content to simply work for others. With a combination of nerve, intelligence, and hard work, he began acquiring his own scrapyards. The details of how a teenager with no capital managed this feat remain somewhat murky, but it's likely that a combination of charm, intimidation, and possibly violence played their parts. What is certain is that by age 22, Charlie Richardson owned 6 scrapyards across South London. This was an extraordinary achievement for someone so young, and it marked him as a businessman of unusual ability. The scrap metal trade was perfect for someone of Charlie's temperament. It was cash-based, largely unregulated, and provided endless opportunities for both legitimate profit and illegal activities. A scrapyard could process stolen goods, serve as a meeting place for criminals, and provide a seemingly legitimate explanation for large amounts of cash. Charlie's business acumen was matched by his physical courage and willingness to use violence. Stories began circulating in South London about the young scrap dealer who wouldn't be pushed around, who settled disputes with his fists, who expected payment on time and in full. These stories, whether entirely true or partly mythologized, served Charlie's purposes perfectly. They established him as someone to be respected and feared. But Charlie Richardson's early criminal career hit a significant bump when he was called up for national service. Like all British men of his generation, Charlie was required to serve in the armed forces. The military represented everything Charlie hated: arbitrary authority, meaningless roles, taking orders from men he considered his inferiors. The clash was inevitable. Charlie's time in the military was brief and inglorious. He served in the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, a placement that actually suited his scrap metal expertise. But his rebellious nature and contempt for military discipline led to repeated clashes with superiors. The exact details vary in different tellings, but all versions agree that Charlie refused to accept military authority and made no effort to hide his contempt for the system. His service ended with a dishonorable discharge, an event that might have shamed other men, but which Charlie seemed to regard with indifference or even pride. He had survived the military, learned nothing except perhaps a deeper contempt for legitimate authority, and was now free to return to his true calling, building his criminal empire. It was during his brief military service that Charlie Richardson had an encounter that would shape his future in unexpected ways. At Shepton Mallet Military Prison, where he served time for various disciplinary infractions, Charlie met members of the Kray twins gang. The Krays, Ronnie and Reggie, were already establishing themselves as major players in London's East End criminal scene. This early meeting planted the seeds of what would become one of the most famous gang rivalries in British criminal history. The meeting was significant for what it revealed about Charlie Richardson's character. Even in prison, even as a young man facing established criminals, Charlie refused to be intimidated. He assessed the Kray associates with the same cold calculation he brought to business deals. He recognized their strength, but also their weaknesses. And he made it clear, without saying so directly, that South London was his territory, and that he would not be pushed around. Not by the Krays or anyone else. When Charlie returned to civilian life, he threw himself into expanding his business empire with renewed energy. The late 1950s were a time of significant social change in Britain. The country was recovering from the war, the economy was growing, and opportunities existed for men willing to work hard and bend or break the rules. Charlie Richardson was willing to do whatever it took. His scrapyards became increasingly profitable, processing enormous quantities of metal and providing steady income. But Charlie was never satisfied with legitimate business alone. He began moving into protection rackets, offering local businesses security in exchange for regular payments. Those who refused found their windows broken, their stock damaged, or worse, Charlie didn't need to make threats explicit. His reputation did the work for him. He also developed a sophisticated fraud operation, one that showed his intelligence and business sense. Using shell companies and false invoices, Charlie and his associates would defraud suppliers and customers alike, always staying just ahead of investigators, always ready with explanations and paperwork that seemed legitimate on first inspection. It was white-collar crime combined with the threat of blue-collar violence, a combination that proved highly effective. By the end of the 1950s, Charlie Richardson was a wealthy man. He owned multiple businesses, drove expensive cars, and lived in a style that would have been unimaginable to the abandoned child in wartime, Camberwell. But wealth alone wasn't enough for Charlie. He wanted power, respect, and control. He wanted to build an empire that would make him untouchable, and he was willing to use any method, no matter how brutal, to achieve his goals. The 1960s dawned with promise for Charlie Richardson. At 26 years old, he stood at the head of a growing criminal organization that combined legitimate business with increasingly sophisticated illegal operations. But Charlie knew that to truly dominate South London's underworld, he needed more than just scrapyards and protection rackets. He needed an organization, a gang that would be both feared and efficient. The foundation of this organization was family. Charlie's brother Eddie had grown into a capable operator in his own right, just 4 years younger than Charlie, but equally committed to building their criminal empire. where Charlie was the strategist and businessman. Eddie brought different skills to the partnership. He was more volatile, quicker to anger, but also more personable and better at managing the day-to-day operations of their various enterprises. Eddie Richardson had developed his own specialty within the organization: fruit machines and gaming operations. The explosion of coffee bars, pubs, and clubs in 1960s London created a perfect opportunity for gaming machine operations. Eddie established a network of fruit machines across South London, ensuring that venues that wanted these profitable devices paid the Richardson organization for the privilege. Those who tried to use machines from competing operators quickly learned their mistake. The fruit machine operation demonstrated the Richardson brothers' business sophistication. They didn't simply intimidate pub owners into accepting their machines. Instead, they offered attractive terms: good revenue splits, regular maintenance, quick replacement of broken machines. The threat of violence was always there, lurking in the background. But the Richardsons understood that a business that seemed beneficial to both parties was more stable and profitable than one based solely on fear. But the legitimate businesses and quasi-legitimate operations like fruit machines were always just the visible portion of the Richardson empire. Underneath, a vast criminal network was growing, one that would eventually span from South London to South Africa, involving fraud, extortion, violence, and international intrigue. Charlie Richardson had an ability to recruit and manage talented criminals that set him apart from other gang leaders. He understood that different jobs required different skills, and he assembled a team that became legendary in London's underworld. These weren't just thugs and enforcers, though the gang had plenty of those. Charlie recruited men with specific expertise: fraudsters who could create convincing false documentation, corrupt officials who could provide information and protection, businessmen who could serve as fronts for illegal operations. The most famous of Charlie's recruits was Francis Davidson Fraser, known throughout London's criminal underworld as Mad Frankie Fraser. Fraser was already a notorious figure by the time he joined the Richardson Gang, with a criminal record dating back to his teenage years and a reputation for extreme violence. But Fraser brought more than just muscle to the organization. He was fiercely loyal, absolutely fearless, and had an almost supernatural ability to intimidate people. Frankie Fraser's nickname, Mad Frankie, would be earned in spectacular fashion during the Richardson Gang's reign. But even before he acquired that moniker, his reputation was formidable. He had served time in some of Britain's harshest prisons, had been certified insane and sent to Broadmoor, and was known for attacking prison guards and inmates with equal enthusiasm. For Charlie Richardson, Fraser was the perfect enforcer, someone who could carry out the most brutal tasks without hesitation or remorse. George Cornell was another key member of the Richardson organization, though his allegiances would shift in ways that would have fatal consequences. Cornell was a professional criminal who brought experience and connections to the gang. He was involved in armed robbery, fraud, and violence, moving easily between different criminal enterprises. His inclusion in the Richardson Gang strengthened their ties to other London criminal organizations. Jimmy Moody joined the Richardson organization as a young man and would go on to become one of the most feared hitmen in British criminal history. Moody was different from Fraser, where Fraser's violence was explosive and often indiscriminate. Moody was cold and calculated. He could kill without emotion, a skill that made him invaluable for certain operations that required permanent solutions to problems. The gang also included Roy Hall, whose specific skill was operating the electrical generator used in torture sessions. Johnny Bradbury, whose eventual betrayal would bring down the organization. Derek Peterman, a tough enforcer who could be counted on for dirty work. These men, and others like them, formed the core of the Richardson Gang, each bringing particular skills to the organization. But Charlie Richardson's genius wasn't just in recruiting talented criminals. It was in creating an organizational structure that allowed them to operate with remarkable efficiency. The gang was compartmentalized, with different members handling different operations. This meant that if one part of the organization was compromised, the others could continue operating. It also meant that most gang members knew only what they needed to know for their specific roles, limiting the damage if someone was arrested and decided to cooperate with police. The Richardson organization's operations expanded rapidly throughout the early 1960s. Protection rackets proliferated across South London, with businesses from pubs to clubs to shops paying regular tributes to ensure their operations continued uninterrupted. The amounts varied based on the business's profitability, but the principle was always the same: pay up or face consequences. These weren't crude shakedowns conducted by unintelligent thugs. Charlie Richardson approached protection rackets like any other business. He understood that taking too much from a business would destroy it, eliminating a source of ongoing revenue instead. The amounts demanded were usually reasonable enough that paying seemed preferable to the alternative. And the Richardson Gang actually did provide some protection, ensuring that other criminals didn't target businesses under their umbrella. The fraud operations became increasingly sophisticated, using a network of front companies. The Richardson Gang would order goods on credit, sell them quickly for cash, and then allow the shell companies to fold without paying suppliers. The profits were substantial, and the legal complexity made prosecution difficult. By the time suppliers realized they'd been defrauded and authorities began investigating, the responsible companies would have ceased to exist, their directors impossible to locate or prove culpable. Money laundering became essential as the gang's profits grew. Charlie Richardson understood that large amounts of cash created problems. Money needed to be legitimized, transformed from criminal proceeds into apparently legal assets. The gang invested heavily in property development, purchasing buildings across South London, renovating them, and either selling them at a profit or collecting rental income. The property market in 1960s London was booming, and these investments both hid the origins of the money and generated additional legitimate income. But it was the gang's international operations that truly set them apart from other British criminal organizations of the era. While most British gangs operated locally or at most nationally, Charlie Richardson thought globally. He established connections in South Africa that would prove both profitable and eventually dangerous. South Africa in the 1960s was in the grip of apartheid, an international pariah, but still economically significant. The country's isolation created opportunities for men willing to operate in moral and legal gray areas. Charlie Richardson saw these opportunities and moved to exploit them. The exact nature of all his South African operations remains unclear. Some were certainly legitimate business deals involving mineral rights in mining operations. Others almost certainly involved more questionable activities. What is known is that Charlie developed relationships with powerful figures in South Africa's security apparatus, including the Bureau of State Security, known as BOSS. These relationships gave him access to intelligence, protection for his operations, and connections that extended throughout southern Africa. In return, Charlie provided services that BOSS found valuable, though the exact nature of these services remains murky even today. One of the most intriguing and controversial claims about the Richardson Gang's activities involves their alleged participation in a plot to tap the telephones of British Prime Minister Harold Wilson. According to some accounts, elements within British intelligence, concerned about Wilson's politics and his relationships with Soviet bloc countries, sought to surveil the Prime Minister. The Richardson Gang, with their South African intelligence connections and technical expertise, were supposedly involved in this operation. The truth of these claims remains disputed. Charlie Richardson himself would later hint at involvement in intelligence-related activities, but he never provided specific details. What is certain is that the Richardson Gang operated at a level of sophistication unusual for British criminals of that era, with international connections and involvement in activities that went beyond traditional organized crime. The gang needed places to meet, to conduct business, to hide when necessary. Their main headquarters was Charlie's Scrapyard in Peckham, but they also maintained other locations. The most interesting of these was the White Horse Pub in Upton, Norfolk, a village far from their South London base. This pub served as what criminals call a bolt hole, a safe location where gang members could hide from police or rival gangs, where meetings could be held away from prying eyes, where planning could occur without surveillance. The choice of Upton was strategic. It was far enough from London to be outside the normal range of metropolitan police operations, but close enough to be reached quickly when needed. The village was small and tight-knit, meaning strangers would be noticed, making it difficult for undercover police to operate there, and the pub itself could be controlled, with trusted associates running it and ensuring that conversations and meetings remained private. Throughout the early 1960s, the Richardson Gang grew in power and reach. They weren't the only criminal organization in London. The Kray twins controlled the East End with an iron fist, and other gangs operated in different areas. But in South London, the Richardsons were supreme. Their combination of legitimate business, sophisticated fraud, international connections, and willingness to use extreme violence made them nearly untouchable. Charlie Richardson himself lived well during these years. He owned a comfortable home, drove luxury cars, dressed in expensive suits, and presented himself as a successful businessman. Those who met him in legitimate business contexts often found him charming and intelligent, a man who seemed to have pulled himself up from poverty through hard work and business acumen. And in a sense, this was true. Charlie was a brilliant businessman. It was just that his business methods included torture and murder. The legitimate facade was important to Charlie, unlike the Kray twins, who courted celebrity and were photographed with actors and politicians. Charlie Richardson preferred to stay in the shadows. He understood that notoriety attracted unwanted attention from police and press. Better to appear as a successful scrap metal dealer and property developer, a self-made man enjoying the fruits of his labor. But beneath this respectable surface, the Richardson organization was becoming increasingly violent. As their empire grew, so did the number of people who owed them money, who competed with their operations, who knew too much or spoke too freely. And Charlie Richardson had developed methods for dealing with these problems. Methods that would earn his organization a name that still carries power more than half a century later: the Torture Gang. There are moments in the history of organized crime that transcend mere criminality and enter the realm of genuine horror. The torture chambers of the Richardson Gang represent one of those moments. What occurred in Charlie Richardson's scrapyard in Peckham during the mid-1960s was not simply criminal violence. It was systematic, calculated infliction of pain designed to terrorize, control, and punish. The name Torture Gang was not a media invention or police hyperbole. It was an accurate description of methods that the Richardson organization employed with cold precision. Unlike other criminal gangs of the era, who might beat someone or even kill them quickly, the Richardsons developed a sophisticated system of torture that served multiple purposes: punishment, information extraction, and most importantly, creating a reputation so terrifying that most people would do anything to avoid experiencing it. The primary location for these activities was Charlie Richardson's scrapyard in Peckham. South London, on the surface, it appeared like any other scrapyard: piles of metal, industrial equipment, workers processing materials. But certain areas of the yard were off-limits to regular workers. And it was in these hidden spaces that the Richardson Gang conducted their most brutal business. The scrapyard location was chosen for practical reasons. It was isolated from residential areas, meaning screams wouldn't attract attention. The industrial noise of metal processing equipment masked sounds from inside. The legitimate business provided cover for people entering and leaving at odd hours. And the equipment available in a scrapyard, heavy tools, power supplies, industrial implements, provided everything needed for their purposes. The torture methods employed by the Richardson Gang were varied and horrific. Pliers were used to extract teeth, one by one, while the victim was held down by multiple gang members. This wasn't done quickly or mercifully. The torture was prolonged, with pauses to ask questions or make demands. The victim's mouth filling with blood as tooth after tooth was wrenched from their gums. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical pain. Victims knew that the torture would continue, that their suffering had only begun. Bolt cutters, the heavy-duty tools used to cut through metal bars and chains, found a different use in the Richardson Gang's arsenal. Toes were the usual target, though fingers were also subjected to this treatment. The victim would be held down, their shoe and sock removed, and then the bolt cutters would be positioned around a toe. Sometimes the cut would be made immediately. Other times, the torturer would pause, increasing the psychological terror, before applying pressure and severing the digit. The pain was extraordinary, the blood loss significant, and the permanent maiming sent a message to anyone who heard about it. Nails, specifically 6-inch industrial nails, were hammered through victims' hands or feet into wooden floors. This method of torture, reminiscent of crucifixion, was particularly effective at immobilizing victims while creating intense pain. The nails would be driven through the softer tissue between bones when possible, maximizing pain while minimizing the chance of hitting major blood vessels that might cause the victim to bleed out too quickly. The victim would be left nailed to the floor while other forms of torture were applied. But perhaps the most infamous of the Richardson Gang's torture methods was the use of electrical shocks. The gang maintained an electrical generator, operated primarily by Roy Hall, who had developed expertise in this particular form of inflicting pain. Electrodes would be attached to various parts of the victim's body. Genitals were a favored target, but ears, fingers, and other sensitive areas were also used. The electrical torture was insidious in its versatility. The voltage could be adjusted to create anything from uncomfortable tingling to convulsive agony. The torturer could shock the victim repeatedly, with breaks in between to ask questions or make demands, unlike physical beatings, which could render a victim unconscious and thus end their suffering temporarily. Electrical torture could be calibrated to keep the victim conscious and in maximum pain for extended periods. The use of electrical torture also demonstrated the Richardson Gang's calculated approach. This wasn't mindless sadism. It was the application of scientific principles to maximize suffering and extract information. Roy Hall became skilled at reading victims' responses, knowing when to increase voltage, when to pause, how to keep them conscious and responsive. It was torture as a technical skill, approached with the same professionalism that Charlie Richardson brought to his business operations. Physical beatings, while more conventional, were no less brutal. Iron bars, baseball bats, and fists were used to inflict massive trauma. But even these beatings were calculated rather than frenzied. The torturer would avoid hitting areas that might cause quick death, no blows to the temple or neck that might kill the victim before the session was complete. Instead, ribs were broken, kidneys damaged, limbs shattered. The victim would be kept alive and conscious for as long as possible. The torture sessions were often preceded by what the gang called kangaroo courts, mock trials held in the scrapyard, where the victim would be brought before Charlie Richardson and other senior gang members. The victim would be accused of whatever transgression had brought them to this point: stealing from the gang, informing to police, failing to pay debts, showing disrespect. These kangaroo courts served multiple purposes. They created a veneer of justice, however twisted, that helped the gang members rationalize what they were about to do. They built psychological terror, as the victims stood before their accusers knowing what was coming, and they served as a form of theater for other gang members, and sometimes for associates who were brought to watch, reinforcing the gang's power and the consequences of crossing them. The case of Benny Colston became legendary in South London's underworld. A cautionary tale of what happened when you crossed the Richardson's. Colston, a minor criminal, was accused of stealing £600 from the organization, a substantial sum in 1960s money, but not extraordinarily large by any reasonable standard. The theft, if it occurred, was a minor matter, but the Richardson Gang didn't operate by reasonable standards. Colston was brought to the scrapyard for his kangaroo court. The trial was brief, the verdict predetermined. Then the torture began over the course of several hours. Colston was subjected to multiple forms of torture. His teeth were pulled with pliers. He was beaten with iron bars. Electrical shocks were applied to his body. Through it all, he was questioned about the money, about who else might have been involved, about whether he had spoken to police. When the torture session finally ended, Colston was in catastrophic condition. His mouth was a bloody ruin. Several toes were missing or mangled. His body was covered in bruises and burns. But the final humiliation was yet to come. Colston was handed his own underpants and told to mop up the blood that had pooled on the floor. Injured, traumatized, degraded, he had to clean up his own blood while his torturers watched. Then he was thrown out onto the street with a warning. If he went to police, he and his family would be killed. If he told anyone what had happened, the torture would be repeated, only worse. Colston kept silent for years, the trauma and fear overwhelming any desire for justice. His case would only become public during the eventual trial, when promises of protection and immunity finally convinced him to testify. The torture wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about information. The Richardson Gang needed to know if their operations had been compromised, if someone was informing to police, if a business rival was planning to move against them. Torture became a grotesque form of due diligence, extracting secrets through pain that would never be revealed through mere questioning. The gang developed a culture of fear that extended far beyond their direct victims. Stories of Richardson torture sessions spread through South London's criminal underworld like a virus, growing more horrific with each retelling. Some stories were exaggerated, but many were not. The truth was terrible enough. The effect was precisely what Charlie Richardson intended. People would do anything to avoid becoming the next victim. Witnesses to crimes committed by the gang were intimidated into silence. Business owners who might have considered reporting extortion decided it was safer to pay. Criminals who might have competed with Richardson operations decided that other territories were preferable. The torture didn't just punish specific individuals. It created a system of control based on terror. What's particularly chilling about the Richardson Gang's torture methods is how they differed from the violence employed by their rivals, the Kray twins. The Krays were certainly violent. They committed murders, beatings, and intimidation, but their violence was often performative, designed to build their reputation as tough guys and celebrities of the underworld. When the Krays killed someone, it was usually quick, a shooting or stabbing that ended the matter. The Richardson Gang's approach was different. Their violence was systematic and prolonged. It wasn't about building a public reputation. Charlie Richardson actively avoided publicity. It was about creating a private reputation among those who mattered in the criminal world. A reputation so terrifying that the mere threat of Richardson Gang detention would be enough to ensure compliance. This difference in approach reflected the different personalities of the gang leaders. The Kray twins, particularly Ronnie, were psychopaths who enjoyed violence and craved recognition. Charlie Richardson was a psychopath of a different type, calculating, controlled, using violence as a tool rather than an end in itself. He understood that fear could be more powerful than affection or respect, and he deliberately cultivated that fear. The torture sessions also served an internal function within the gang. They bonded the members together in shared brutality, creating a collective guilt that made betrayal less likely. Once you've participated in torturing someone, you're committed to the organization in a way that can't be easily undone. The torture made accomplices of everyone who witnessed it, creating a web of complicity that strengthened the gang's cohesion. Roy Hall's role as the electrical torture specialist is particularly interesting from a psychological perspective. Hall wasn't a mindless brute. He was a skilled technician who had learned how to calibrate pain, how to keep victims conscious, how to maximize suffering without causing death. This required a peculiar kind of intelligence and a complete absence of empathy. Hall could chat casually with other gang members while inflicting agony on a victim, treating his work as just another job requiring particular skills. The victims of Richardson torture came from various backgrounds. Some were criminals themselves, people involved in the underworld who had crossed the gang in some way. Others were legitimate businessmen who had refused to pay extortion or had competed with Richardson Enterprises. Some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, knowing something the gang wanted to keep hidden or possessing something the gang wanted to acquire. What united the victims was their vulnerability. The Richardson Gang targeted people who couldn't easily go to the police, who didn't have powerful protectors, who wouldn't be missed if they disappeared, or would be too afraid to speak even if they survived. This calculated selection of victims allowed the torture to continue for years without police intervention. The few victims who did report their torture to police found that the Metropolitan Police in the 1960s was itself compromised by corruption. Several officers were on the Richardson payroll, providing information about investigations and warnings about planned raids. Victims who reported torture might find their statements mysteriously lost, their cases never investigated, or worse, their names leaked back to the gang with predictable consequences. Charlie Richardson would later boast about having coppers in his pocket, and this wasn't empty bragging. The level of corruption in the Metropolitan Police during this era was extraordinary. The Richardson Gang, with their substantial illegal income, could afford to pay well for protection, and many officers were willing to accept these payments. This corruption created a situation where the torture could continue with little fear of prosecution. The ecosystem of fear that the Richardson Gang created in South London was self-perpetuating. Each torture session created new people who were terrified of the gang. These people would warn others, spreading the fear further. The reputation grew with each horror story, and as the reputation grew, the gang's actual power increased. Eventually, in many parts of South London, the mere mention of Charlie Richardson's name was enough to ensure compliance with whatever was being demanded. But this system, as effective as it was, contained the seeds of its own destruction. Every torture victim was a potential witness. Every person who participated in the torture was a potential informant. Every corrupt police officer was a vulnerability. The Richardson Gang's reign of terror created a vast web of secrets and trauma. And eventually, as we shall see, that web would unravel catastrophically. For now, though, in the mid-1960s, the Richardson Gang seemed untouchable. Their torture methods gave them power over South London's underworld. It seemed absolute. Other criminals feared them. Police were corrupted or intimidated. Victims remained silent. The empire built on pain and terror appeared solid. It would take a combination of extraordinary events, betrayal, violence, and one very specific night in March 1966 to finally bring the torture gang to justice. London in the 1960s was divided, not just geographically, Though the Thames certainly provided a natural boundary between North and South, the division was one of criminal empires, each ruled by men who had risen from poverty to power through violence, cunning, and absolute ruthlessness. In the East End, the Kray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, held court like kings. In South London, the Richardson brothers, Charlie and Eddie, built their own kingdom. The collision between these empires was inevitable. The Kray twins and the Richardson brothers represented two different approaches to organized crime, two different philosophies of power. The Krays were flamboyant, courting celebrity, photographed with actors and politicians, cultivating an image as London's premier gangsters. They owned nightclubs where the famous and fashionable mingled with the criminal underworld. They gave interviews, posed for photographs, and seemed to revel in their notoriety. Charlie Richardson took the opposite approach. He avoided publicity, preferring to operate in shadows, where the Krays might be found at glamorous nightclub openings. Charlie was more likely to be in his scrapyard office, conducting business away from prying eyes, where the Krays built their reputation through public displays of violence and power. Charlie built his through whispered horror stories that spread through the underworld like contagion. But despite these differences in style, both organizations recognized that London was large enough for multiple criminal enterprises. There was no inherent reason for conflict. The Krays controlled different territories, had different rackets, and operated in different social circles. For a time, an uneasy peace prevailed, based on mutual respect for each other's power and a practical understanding that a gang war would benefit no one except the police. The initial meetings between representatives of the two organizations were civil, even cordial. The Grave Morris pub became a neutral meeting ground where discussions could occur. These weren't social occasions. These were business meetings between rival corporations, discussing territories, settling disputes before they escalated, ensuring that misunderstandings didn't lead to violence. Charlie Richardson and Ronnie Kray had met during their earlier prison encounters, and there was a wary mutual respect between them. Both recognized in the other a certain quality, the willingness to do absolutely anything to maintain power. Both were intelligent enough to understand that cooperation was often more profitable than conflict. And both were psychopathic enough that normal human emotions didn't cloud their business judgments. For several years in the early 1960s, this arrangement held. The Krays operated their protection rackets, nightclubs, and other enterprises in the East End and parts of North London. The Richardsons controlled South London with their scrapyards, fraud operations, and torture chambers. Occasionally, disputes would arise. A club owner who paid the Krays might move to a location in Richardson territory, or a criminal who worked for one gang might be found operating in the other's area. But these disputes were generally resolved through negotiation rather than violence. The uneasy peace began to crack in December 1965 at an event that should have been festive, a Christmas party at the Astor Club, one of the Krays' establishments in the West End. The club was packed that night with criminals from across London, everyone in a celebratory mood, drinks flowing freely. It should have been a night of revelry and temporary goodwill. George Cornell, who had been associated with the Richardson Gang, attended the party. Cornell was a big man with a loud mouth, known for his crude sense of humor and his tendency to say things that others might wisely keep to themselves. He had been drinking heavily, and at some point during the evening, Cornell made a fatal mistake. He called Ronnie Kray a fat poof. In the context of 1960s London's criminal underworld, this was an unforgivable insult. Ronnie Kray was homosexual at a time when homosexuality was still illegal in Britain, and he was deeply sensitive about it. Moreover, to insult a gang leader publicly in front of witnesses was to challenge his authority and power. It couldn't be allowed to pass. The immediate consequences were restrained only by the venue and the number of witnesses. Ronnie Kray didn't respond violently at the Christmas party. To do so would have caused a riot and brought unwanted police attention. But everyone present understood that Cornell had signed his own death warrant. The only question was when and how Ronnie would extract his revenge. Cornell, realizing his mistake, began distancing himself from the Richardson Gang in the hope that it would protect him from Kray retaliation. The Richardson brothers found themselves in an awkward position. Defending Cornell might mean war with the Krays, but abandoning him made them look weak. The delicate balance between the two organizations began to tilt toward open conflict. Throughout early 1966, tensions escalated. Small incidents that might previously have been resolved through negotiation now festered and grew. A Richardson associate beaten in East End territory. A Kray enforcer roughed up in South London. Threats exchanged. Meetings that once were cordial becoming tense and hostile. The personalities of the gang leaders played a crucial role in this escalation. Ronnie Kray was the more volatile of the twins, prone to sudden violence and increasingly affected by paranoid schizophrenia. His brother Reggie was more controlled, but equally committed to maintaining their power and reputation. Charlie Richardson was calculating and business-focused, but he couldn't show weakness without undermining his authority. Eddie Richardson was more hot-headed than his brother, quicker to advocate for violent responses. The differences between the two gangs became more apparent as conflict loomed. The Kray twins cultivated relationships with corrupt police officers, but they were also known to police through their public profile. The Richardsons had deeper corruption networks, with more officers on their payroll and more sophisticated methods of avoiding detection. The Krays were known for quick, decisive violence, stabbings and shootings that ended disputes permanently. The Richardsons preferred their torture methods, prolonged sessions that served as warnings to others. From a strategic standpoint, both organizations had significant resources. The Krays had a larger gang membership and controlled wealthier territories in the West End and parts of North London. The Richardsons had their international connections, sophisticated fraud operations, and their reputation for extreme brutality. A full gang war would be devastating for both sides within the Metropolitan Police. The rivalry between the gangs was creating serious concerns. The level of corruption was so extensive that it's estimated the Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, was considering replacing up to 70% of the Criminal Investigation Department. Officers on the Richardson payroll were providing intelligence about Kray operations, and vice versa. The police force itself was fractured along gang lines, with different factions supporting or being controlled by different criminal organizations. This corruption created a bizarre situation where major criminal investigations were being compromised before they even began. When police did attempt to investigate Richardson Gang activities, officers on the gang's payroll would leak information about the investigation, allowing evidence to be destroyed and witnesses to be intimidated. The same was true for investigations into Kray activities. The gangs weren't just fighting each other. They had parasitically infiltrated the very organization supposed to stop them. Charlie Richardson's boasts about having coppers in his pocket were well-founded. Multiple officers were receiving regular payments to provide information, warn about investigations, and actively obstruct justice. Some officers were compromised through blackmail. The gangs had evidence of their misconduct that could destroy their careers. Others were simply greedy, willing to accept money in exchange for betraying their duties. And some genuinely believed that working with one gang to control crime was preferable to the chaos that might result from a power vacuum. But the most concerning aspect of the Kray-Richardson rivalry was what it revealed about the breakdown of rule of law in London. Here were two criminal organizations operating openly, controlling vast territories, corrupting police officers, and preparing for what amounted to urban warfare, and the authorities seemed powerless to stop them. The psychological warfare between the gangs intensified through early 1966. The Krays spread stories about Richardson torture methods, painting their rivals as sadistic monsters while positioning themselves as more honorable criminals. The Richardsons countered by highlighting Kray brutality and questioning their sanity, particularly Ronnie's increasingly erratic behavior. Both organizations understood the power of reputation in the criminal underworld. A gang's reputation could be more important than its actual strength, because reputation determined who would dare to challenge you, who would pay protection without resistance, who would inform to police. The Krays worked to build a reputation as glamorous but deadly, the kind of men who could be charming at a nightclub opening and murderous to anyone who crossed them. The Richardsons built a reputation based on pure fear, the kind of fear that came from knowing that crossing them meant hours of agony in a scrapyard torture chamber. Associates of both gangs found themselves in increasingly difficult positions. Criminals who had worked with both organizations had to choose sides. Club owners and business people who had paid protection to both gangs needed to decide where their primary loyalty lay. These decisions had life or death consequences. Choosing wrong could mean torture and death. George Cornell, the man whose drunken insult had helped spark the escalation, was living in a state of constant fear. He knew Ronnie Kray hadn't forgotten the insult, and he knew that Ronnie's revenge would come eventually. Cornell tried to stay in public places, surrounded by people, making himself a difficult target. But he also knew he couldn't live that way forever. The tension was building toward an explosive release. Both organizations were recruiting, strengthening their numbers, preparing for potential conflict. Weapons were being acquired, guns, knives, clubs, safe houses were established. Escape routes planned, like two armies mobilizing for war. The Kray and Richardson organizations prepared for violence. What's fascinating from a historical perspective is how this gang rivalry reflected broader social changes in 1960s London. The city was transforming, with old working-class neighborhoods being redeveloped, traditional communities breaking apart, and new opportunities emerging. The criminal underworld was changing too, with the old-style local protection rackets giving way to more sophisticated operations involving fraud, international connections, and large-scale corruption. The Krays and the Richardsons represented different visions of what organized crime could become in this new London. The Krays saw opportunities in nightclubs, entertainment, and the mingling of legitimate celebrity with criminal power. The Richardsons saw opportunities in business fraud, international operations, and the systematic exploitation of legal and regulatory loopholes. Both were evolving beyond the simple street-level criminality of previous generations. But for all their sophistication, both organizations were still ultimately based on violence. The Krays might socialize with actors and politicians, but their power still came from the threat of a knife or gun. The Richardsons might have international connections and complex fraud schemes, but their power still came from the torture chamber in the scrapyard. Violence was the foundation upon which everything else was built. As winter turned to spring in 1966, London's criminal underworld was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Kray-Richardson rivalry had created two armed camps, each watching the other, each waiting for the opportunity to strike. Associates of both gangs were nervous, knowing that violence could erupt at any moment. Police officers, both honest and corrupt, watched with concern, understanding that a full gang war would mean blood on London's streets. The spark, when it came, wouldn't be from the Kray-Richardson rivalry directly. Instead, it would come from a smaller dispute, a minor gangster making a drunken insult, a situation that spiraled out of control in a matter of minutes. The night of March 7th to 8th, 1966, would see violence erupt at Mr. Smith's and the Witch Doctor Club in Catford, a shooting that would leave one man dead and set in motion the events that would destroy the Richardson Empire. But before we get to that fateful night, it's important to understand that the Kray-Richardson rivalry, while not directly causing the shootout, had created the atmosphere of tension and violence that made such an explosion inevitable. The gang's preparations for conflict meant that men were armed and ready for violence. The heightened tensions meant that minor insults could escalate into deadly confrontations. The culture of violence that both organizations had cultivated meant that backing down was seen as weakness. In a different time, with different leadership, the dispute at Mr. Smith's club might have been resolved with a fistfight or a tense conversation. But in March 1966, with London's gangs on edge and violence in the air, a minor dispute would become a bloodbath that would change everything. March 7, 1966, began as an ordinary Monday evening in South London. Workers were heading home from jobs, families were gathering for dinner, and in the pubs and clubs of Catford, the usual crowd was assembling for a night of drinking and socializing. Nobody could have predicted that before dawn. One man would be dead, several others seriously injured, and the Richardson Gang's empire would begin its catastrophic collapse. Mr. Smith's and the Witch Doctor Club occupied a building on Rushy Green in Catford. South London, the club was owned by Doogie Flood and Bill Benny, and like many clubs in the area, it operated under the protection of the Richardson Gang. This protection arrangement meant regular payments to the Richardsons in exchange for ensuring that other criminals didn't target the establishment, and that any trouble was handled by Richardson enforcers rather than police. The club itself was typical of 1960s London nightlife: dim lighting, a small dance floor, a bar that did steady business, and a clientele that mixed legitimate working-class patrons with criminals and those who associated with them. It was the kind of place where a factory worker might rub shoulders with a known gangster, where business deals both legal and illegal were conducted over drinks, where violence simmered just beneath the surface of apparent conviviality. On this particular Monday evening, members of the Richardson Gang were present in the club, drinking and socializing. Charlie Richardson himself was not there. He was often absent from such gatherings, preferring to maintain some distance from the street-level activities of his organization. But other senior members were present, including Eddie Richardson, Frankie Fraser, and several other associates. Also present that night was the Billy Hayward Gang, a smaller criminal organization that operated in the area. Hayward and his associates weren't rivals to the Richardsons in any serious sense. They operated at a lower level, involved in smaller-scale criminal activities. But they had their pride and their own reputations to maintain. And mixing gangsters from different organizations in a confined space with alcohol flowing freely was always a recipe for potential trouble. The exact sequence of events that led to the violence is disputed, with different participants giving varying accounts. What is clear is that at some point during the evening, Peter Hennessy, associated with the Hayward Gang, made a comment directed at Eddie Richardson. According to the most widely accepted account, Hennessy called Eddie Richardson a half-baked fucking ponce. In the context of London's criminal underworld, this was a serious insult. To call someone a ponce, slang for a pimp or someone who lived off others' earnings, was to question their legitimacy as a criminal. To call them half-baked was to question their competence. And to say it publicly, in front of witnesses from both gangs, was a direct challenge to Eddie Richardson's authority and reputation. Eddie Richardson's response was immediate and aggressive. According to witnesses, he stood up and said to Hennessy, "I can take you any fucking time you like." This was both a threat and a challenge, an invitation to settle the insult through violence. In another context, this might have led to a fistfight outside the club, a brief scuffle that would end with honor satisfied and both parties nursing bruises and grudges. But this wasn't a normal context. the tension between gangs that had been building for months, the culture of violence that the Richardson organization had cultivated, and the presence of armed men turned what might have been a simple fistfight into something far more deadly. Fists began to fly, according to witnesses. The initial violence was conventional. Punches thrown, men grappling, the kind of bar fight that was common enough in working-class pubs and clubs. Furniture was knocked over, drinks spilled, women screamed and moved away from the violence. The bouncers, who normally would have broken up such a fight, were smart enough to stay clear when gang members were involved. Interfering could be fatal. Then someone pulled a gun. Richard "Dickie" Hart was a small-time criminal with associations to the Kray twins. His presence at Mr. Smith's club that night was likely coincidental. He wasn't there as a Kray representative. But the association would later add another layer of complexity to the incident. Hart pulled out a revolver, pointed it at the fighting men, and shouted, "Somebody's going to die." The introduction of a firearm transformed the situation completely. Fistfights, no matter how violent, rarely resulted in deaths, but guns changed everything. The other patrons of the club, realizing that shots might be fired, scrambled for exits or threw themselves to the floor. The violence that had been chaotic but contained suddenly became potentially lethal. Harry Rawlings, another man present at the club, was the first to be shot. The bullet struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into tables. The sound of the gunshot in the confined space was deafening, and for a moment, everyone froze, the reality of the situation crashing down on them. This wasn't just a fistfight anymore. This was attempted murder. Jimmy Moody and Ronnie Jeffries, both Richardson associates, rushed to Rawlings' aid, trying to evacuate the wounded man from the club. But the violence was escalating rather than stopping. More gunshots rang out. Billy Gardner, associated with the Hayward Gang, had also armed himself. He pulled his gun and fired at Frankie Fraser, the bullet striking Fraser in the thigh. Fraser, true to his reputation for toughness, barely seemed to register the wound. Instead, with blood streaming down his leg, Fraser charged at Dickie Hart, who was still holding his gun. What happened next would become legendary in London's criminal underworld. Fraser, despite being shot, managed to knock the gun from Hart's hand. Then, with the savage fury that had earned him a reputation as one of London's most dangerous men, Fraser began beating Hart with his fists and whatever objects came to hand. Witnesses described it as a berserker rage, Fraser punching and kicking Hart with such violence that it seemed he intended to beat him to death with his bare hands. Henry Botten, another man present during the carnage, watched Fraser's assault on Hart with something like awe as the beating continued. Botten said words that would become famous. "You're fucking mad. Frank, you're fucking bonkers." It was this comment, made in the midst of ultra-violence, that would cement Fraser's nickname. From that night forward, he would be known throughout London's underworld as Mad Frankie Fraser. But Fraser's assault on Hart was interrupted by more gunfire. In the chaos, with multiple people armed, shots being fired, people scrambling for cover, Dickie Hart was shot. The bullet struck him as he was trying to escape from Fraser's assault, and Hart went down, bleeding heavily. The scene inside Mr. Smith's club was now pure chaos. Multiple people had been shot, blood pooled on the floor, overturned furniture, and shattered glass littered the space. The air stank of gunpowder and fear. People were screaming, crying, trying to help the wounded, or simply trying to escape. One witness would later describe it as being like Dodge City, a reference to the Wild West gunfights of American legend. Eddie Richardson and Frankie Fraser, both wounded Richardson less seriously than Fraser, managed to make their way out of the club. They were helped by associates into a car and driven to Lewisham Hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, both men followed the criminal code of silence. Asked what had happened, they claimed to know nothing. They'd been shot, they said, but they had no idea who had shot them or why. They certainly weren't going to cooperate with any police investigation. Back at Mr. Smith's club, the scene was carnage. Dickie Hart was dying from his gunshot wound. He would be dead before an ambulance could get him to hospital. Harry Rawlings was seriously wounded, but would survive. Others had minor injuries from flying glass, ricocheting bullets, and the general violence of the melee. When police arrived, they found a crime scene unlike anything they'd encountered before. The club looked like a war zone. Blood spattered the walls and pooled on the floor. Shell casings littered the area. Witnesses were either fleeing the scene or sitting in shock, unable to fully process what they'd experienced. And in the middle of it all, Dickie Hart's body lay cooling. The police investigation began immediately, but investigators quickly encountered the wall of silence that always surrounded gang-related violence. Witnesses claimed they hadn't seen anything, couldn't identify anyone, didn't know what had happened. The club's owners insisted it had been a random fight that had gotten out of hand, nothing to do with any gangs. The few patrons who could be convinced to speak gave contradictory accounts that were clearly designed to mislead rather than illuminate. At Lewisham Hospital, Eddie Richardson and Frankie Fraser maintained their silence. The doctors treating them were professional enough not to push for information. In 1960s South London, medical professionals understood that asking too many questions about gunshot wounds could be hazardous to one's health. The police officers who attempted to question the wounded men got nothing but denials and claims of ignorance. But despite the wall of silence, the police understood what had happened. This was gang warfare erupting into open violence. The presence of weapons, the multiple shootings, the death of Dickie Hart, all of this pointed to an escalation in criminal violence that threatened to spiral out of control. If gangs were now engaging in gunfights in public clubs, it was only a matter of time before innocent bystanders were killed. The shootout at Mr. Smith's club had immediate consequences for the Richardson Gang. The violence had been too public, too dramatic, too deadly to be ignored. A man had died, multiple others had been shot. And while the traditional wall of silence might prevent individual prosecutions, the incident had drawn attention to the gang that they couldn't afford. For Charlie Richardson, who prided himself on operating in the shadows, avoiding attention, conducting business quietly, the Mr. Smith's shootout was a disaster. His brother Eddie had been involved in a public gunfight that had left one man dead. Frankie Fraser, one of his key enforcers, had been shot and had beaten a man who subsequently died. The whole incident had occurred in a club under Richardson protection, making it impossible to deny their involvement. Moreover, the violence had occurred at a time when police were already investigating Richardson Gang activities. The shootout provided additional impetus for the investigation, additional political pressure to bring gang violence under control. Home Office officials, already concerned about the level of corruption in the Metropolitan Police, now had a dead body and a public shootout to explain. The incident also complicated the already tense relationship with the Kray twins. Dickie Hart, while not a senior Kray gang member, had associations with the twins. His death in a fight with the Richardson associates would require some response from the Krays, even if they hadn't been directly involved in the initial dispute. The fragile peace between East End and South London was further strained. In the days following the shootout, both police and gang members tried to understand what had happened and what it meant. For the police, it was clear that gang violence was escalating beyond what could be tolerated. For the gangs, it was a reminder that violence, while essential to their power, could also spiral out of control in ways that threatened their very existence. Frankie Fraser, recovering from his gunshot wound, seemed almost pleased with the nickname he'd acquired. Mad Frankie Fraser. It had a ring to it, a reputation that would serve him well in the underworld. He'd been shot and had still beaten a man so savagely that witnesses were traumatized. That was the kind of reputation that made people think twice before crossing you. But for Charlie Richardson, there was no pleasure in the aftermath of the shootout. He understood, with the calculating intelligence that had built his empire, that everything was about to change. The violence had been too public. The police investigation would intensify. And somewhere in South Africa, Johnny Bradbury, facing the hangman's noose for murder, was about to make a decision that would destroy the Richardson Gang completely. The night of March 7th to 8th, 1966, would be remembered as the beginning of the end for the torture gang. The empire built on fear and pain was about to collapse, brought down by a combination of violence, betrayal, and the relentless work of a few incorruptible police officers who refused to let corruption and brutality continue unchecked. The investigation into the Richardson Gang had actually begun months before the shootout at Mr. Smith's club, but that violent night in March 1966 accelerated everything. To understand how the seemingly untouchable torture gang was finally brought to justice, we need to go back to July 1965, when a terrified victim finally found the courage to approach police with his story. The victim's name has been protected over the years, but his testimony would prove crucial. He came to a police station in South London and told a story that shocked even experienced officers. He described being brought to a kangaroo court in a scrapyard, being accused of stealing money, and then being subjected to hours of torture. He described the pliers that pulled his teeth, the beatings that left him barely conscious, and the final humiliation of being forced to mop up his own blood with his underpants, before being thrown out onto the street with threats of worse to come if he spoke to anyone. The officers who took his statement faced a dilemma. They believed him. The physical evidence of his injuries supported his story, but they also understood the difficulties of building a case against the Richardson Gang. The victim was terrified of retaliation and reluctant to testify in court. There were no other witnesses willing to come forward. The gang had carefully ensured that no physical evidence remained at the torture site, and most problematically, some officers in the Metropolitan Police were on the Richardson payroll and would certainly warn the gang if a formal investigation was launched. This last point was particularly vexing. How do you investigate a criminal organization when the organization has infiltrated the very police force conducting the investigation? Every move police made would be reported to the gang, giving them time to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and prepare defenses. It was like trying to surprise someone while they watched your every move in a mirror. The solution came from an unusual source: the Home Office itself, government officials. Increasingly concerned about the level of corruption in London's Metropolitan Police, made a bold decision. They would create a special investigation team, staffed primarily by officers from outside London, men who had no connections to the Richardson Gang and couldn't be easily corrupted. The team would be led by Inspector Gerald MacArthur, an incorruptible officer with a reputation for relentless pursuit of criminals. MacArthur was given extraordinary authority to investigate the Richardson Gang without informing the regular Metropolitan Police seed. He recruited officers primarily from the Hertfordshire Constabulary, men who had no history with London gangs and no reason to be on anyone's payroll. This team would work in secrecy, building their case carefully, trusting no one outside their immediate circle. The investigation proceeded slowly through late 1965 and early 1966. MacArthur's team spoke with victims, many of whom were initially reluctant to cooperate. They offered immunity from prosecution for crimes these victims might have committed, understanding that many people tortured by the Richardson Gang were themselves criminals who couldn't go to police without risking their own arrests. They provided protection for those willing to testify, moving them to safe locations where the gang couldn't reach them. But the breakthrough that would crack the case wide open came from South Africa, from a man facing death and desperately seeking a way to survive. Johnny Bradbury had been a trusted member of the Richardson Gang, involved in their South African operations. In July 1966, Bradbury was arrested in South Africa for the murder of Thomas Waldeck, a business associate. The evidence against him was strong, and South African justice in 1966 was swift and harsh. Bradbury was convicted and sentenced to hang, sitting in a South African prison. Counting down the days to his execution, Johnny Bradbury made a calculation. He could maintain his loyalty to the Richardson Gang and die on the gallows, or he could trade information for his life. The choice wasn't difficult. Bradbury contacted British authorities and offered a deal. He would provide detailed information about the Richardson Gang's operations, torture sessions, frauds, international connections, everything he knew, in exchange for a pardon and immunity from prosecution. He would become the star witness against the organization he'd served. British authorities recognized the value of Bradbury's testimony. Here was someone who could provide insider information about the gang's activities, who could identify participants in specific crimes, who could break through the wall of silence that had protected the Richardsons for years. Negotiations began between British and South African officials to arrange for Bradbury's extradition in exchange for his testimony. The timing was perfect for the prosecution and disastrous for Charlie Richardson. Inspector MacArthur's team had been building their case methodically, interviewing victims and associates now. With Bradbury's inside information, they could connect the dots that had previously seemed separate, understand the full scope of the Richardson organization, and identify specific crimes with sufficient evidence for prosecution. Throughout spring and early summer of 1966, MacArthur's team worked around the clock. They interviewed dozens of people, many of whom had been too terrified to speak before, but who now, with promises of protection and immunity, began to open up about their experiences with the Richardson Gang. The picture that emerged was horrifying. Years of systematic torture, fraud, and violence, all conducted with apparent impunity, while corrupt police officers looked the other way. The investigation had to be conducted in absolute secrecy. MacArthur understood that if the Richardson Gang learned they were about to be arrested, they would flee, destroy evidence, and possibly kill witnesses. The element of surprise was crucial. So even as the investigation proceeded, even as evidence was gathered and arrest warrants prepared, MacArthur ensured that nothing leaked to the press or to the Metropolitan Police officers who might warn the gang. The date chosen for the arrests was July 30th, 1966. The selection of this particular date would later seem almost prophetic in its symbolism. Nobody on MacArthur's team could have predicted the significance it would hold in British history. But the coincidence would become one of the most memorable aspects of the Richardson Gang's downfall. July 30th, 1966, was the day England won the World Cup at Wembley Stadium. England defeated West Germany 4-2 in extra time, with Geoff Hurst scoring a hat-trick that is still celebrated as one of the greatest moments in English football history. The entire nation was focused on the match, gathered around televisions and radios, united in celebration of England's greatest sporting achievement, while 93,000 people watched at Wembley and millions more across the country celebrated England's victory. 70 police officers were conducting coordinated dawn raids across southeast London. At precisely the moment when England was experiencing its finest hour on the football pitch, Charlie Richardson was experiencing his worst hour. Being hauled out of bed by police and placed under arrest, the symbolism was almost too perfect. England's greatest triumph occurring simultaneously with the fall of one of its most brutal criminal organizations. The irony would not be lost on commentators, then or later. While the nation celebrated victory and national pride, Police were arresting men who had terrorized a large part of London for years. Charlie Richardson was seized in bed at his home, given no opportunity to flee or destroy evidence. Simultaneously, raids were conducted at the homes of Eddie Richardson, Frankie Fraser, and 9 other gang members. The coordination was perfect. Everyone was arrested within minutes of each other, preventing anyone from warning the others. Years of planning, months of secret investigation, all coming together in one carefully orchestrated operation. The arrests sent shockwaves through London's criminal underworld. The Richardson Gang had seemed untouchable, protected by corrupt police and fear. The fact that they could be arrested so suddenly, so completely, demonstrated that the rules were changing. No gang was truly untouchable. No amount of corruption could protect you forever. Charlie Richardson's first reaction to his arrest was reportedly calm. He was a smart man who understood that panic accomplished nothing. He refused to answer questions without his lawyer present, and when his lawyer arrived, Richardson maintained his innocence. He was a legitimate businessman, he claimed. Any allegations of torture or violence were lies told by criminals seeking to avoid their own prosecutions. The scrapyards were legitimate businesses. The property developments were legal. Everything was above board. But MacArthur's team had built their case carefully. They had victim testimony, including from Bradbury. They had physical evidence from some of the torture sites. They had testimony from gang members who had been granted immunity in exchange for cooperating. They had documentation of the fraud schemes. The wall of silence that had protected the gang for years was crumbling brick by brick, as fear of Richardson retaliation was replaced by fear of prosecution and the hope that cooperation might lead to lighter sentences. The 11 gang members were charged with a variety of crimes: fraud, extortion, assault, grievous bodily harm. The charges laid out a pattern of criminality spanning years, involving dozens of victims, and demonstrating a level of organized brutality that shocked even experienced prosecutors. In the cells of various South London police stations, the arrested gang members faced the reality of their situation. Years of operating with impunity were over. The empire built on torture and fear had collapsed in a single morning. Some, like Charlie Richardson, maintained their composure, understanding that the legal battle was just beginning. Others were less stoic, realizing that they faced potentially decades in prison. Eddie Richardson, still recovering from his injuries from the Mr. Smith shootout, faced additional charges related to that incident. The combination of the torture charges and the shooting charges meant he was looking at potentially spending the rest of his productive life in prison. Frankie Fraser, true to his reputation, showed no fear or remorse. If anything, he seemed almost proud of the charges against him. The torture, the violence, the fear, these were badges of honor in Fraser's mind, proof of his toughness and commitment to the criminal life. His lack of conventional conscience would actually serve him well in prison, where regret and guilt were seen as weaknesses. The news of the arrests broke as the nation was still celebrating England's World Cup victory. The front pages of Sunday newspapers on July 31st carried 2 stories: England's triumph and the Richardson Gang arrests. The contrast between the 2 stories couldn't have been more stark. While England had shown the world the best of British sport and determination, the Richardson case showed the dark underbelly of British society, the violence and corruption that existed in the shadows. For Inspector MacArthur and his team, the arrests were satisfying, but they understood that the hard work was just beginning. Arrests were one thing. Convictions were another. They needed to ensure that their witnesses remained safe and willing to testify. They needed to build airtight cases that could withstand the defense attorneys that Richardson money would buy. And they needed to do all of this while dealing with a metropolitan police force that remained partially corrupted by criminal influence. The investigation had revealed the extraordinary extent of Richardson Gang corruption within the police. Officers had been receiving regular payments for information. Case files had been leaked or destroyed. Investigations had been deliberately sabotaged. The Richardson case would ultimately lead to significant reforms in the Metropolitan Police, with dozens of officers either dismissed or forced to resign. But all of that was for the future. In late July 1966, the priority was ensuring that the Richardson Gang members stayed in custody and that the cases against them proceeded to trial. Charlie Richardson, with his substantial resources, immediately began working on his defense. He hired the best lawyers money could buy, men who specialized in defending accused gangsters and who were skilled at creating reasonable doubt, discrediting witnesses, and exploiting any weakness in the prosecution's case. The stage was set for what would become one of the most sensational trials in British criminal history. The torture trial, as it would come to be known, would expose the full horror of the Richardson Gang's activities to public scrutiny. Witnesses would describe in graphic detail the torture they had endured. The prosecution would lay out the full scope of the gang's criminal enterprise, and ultimately, a jury would have to decide whether the evidence was sufficient to convict men who had operated with apparent impunity for years. As summer turned to autumn in 1966, and the trial date approached, Charlie Richardson sat in his cell, no doubt calculating his options, planning his defense, and perhaps reflecting on how quickly an empire could fall. The scrap metal king, the man who had built a criminal organization from nothing, who had ruled South London through fear and torture, was now just another prisoner awaiting trial. The walls had closed in completely. The empire was finished. All that remained was the reckoning. In April 1967, the Old Bailey, London's central criminal court, became the stage for a trial that would captivate and horrify the British public. The case was officially dubbed the torture trial, even before it began, a name that reflected both the charges being brought and the public fascination with the dark details that would emerge during proceedings. The Old Bailey itself is an imposing building, designed to project the majesty and authority of British law. Its main criminal court, Court Number 1, had seen countless trials of murderers, traitors, and criminals of all types. But even by the Old Bailey standards, the Richardson trial was extraordinary. Here were men accused not just of conventional crimes like fraud or assault, but of systematic torture carried out over years with apparent impunity. The defendants were led into the dock. Charlie Richardson, the alleged mastermind and leader. Eddie Richardson, his brother and lieutenant. Mad Frankie Fraser, the enforcer whose reputation for violence preceded him. And other gang members charged with various roles in the organization's activities. They stood before the court in suits rather than prison clothes, their lawyers having ensured they appeared as respectable as possible. Charlie Richardson, at 33 years old, presented himself as a successful businessman wrongly accused by criminals, seeking revenge or favorable treatment from prosecutors. He was calm, well-dressed, and projected an air of confidence that suggested he believed he would be acquitted. Those who had faced him in the scrapyard torture chamber might have recognized that same cold calculation in his eyes. The charges were extensive: fraud, extortion, assault, grievous bodily harm. But it was the testimony about torture that would dominate the trial and capture public attention. The prosecutors, armed with victim testimony and the insider information provided by Johnny Bradbury, laid out a case that painted the Richardson Gang as one of the most brutal criminal organizations in British history. The judge, Mr. Justice Lawton, was a stern figure known for his no-nonsense approach to criminal trials. He made it clear from the outset that he would tolerate no disruptions, that the trial would proceed with dignity despite the horrific nature of the evidence, and that he expected all parties to conduct themselves appropriately. His determination to see justice done would prove crucial as the trial proceeded. The prosecution's opening statements laid out the scope of the gang's activities. They described how Charlie Richardson had built a criminal empire using his legitimate scrap metal businesses as cover. They explained the protection rackets, the fraud schemes, the international connections. But most importantly, they described the torture, the systematic use of extreme violence to punish, intimidate, and control. Then came the witnesses, and it was their testimony that truly brought home the horror of what had occurred. Benny Colston took the stand. The man who had been accused of stealing 600 pounds and subjected to hours of torture, with visible difficulty, his voice sometimes breaking with emotion. Colston described being brought to the scrapyard, the kangaroo court, the accusations. Then he described the torture itself. The courtroom sat in silence as Colston described how multiple men had held him down while Frankie Fraser approached with pliers. The extraction of his teeth, one by one, while he screamed and begged for mercy. The blood filling his mouth, choking him. The pain beyond anything he'd imagined possible. The beatings that came after, the ribs broken, the electrical shocks applied to his body, the jury members, many of whom had lived sheltered lives far removed from criminal violence, visibly reacted to this testimony. Some looked sick, others angry. The defense attorneys objected to the graphic nature of the description, arguing that it was prejudicial, but Justice Lawton overruled them. The jury had a right to understand exactly what had occurred. He ruled. Colston described the final humiliation, being handed his own underpants and forced to mop up the blood that had pooled on the floor while his torturers watched and laughed. Then being thrown out onto the street with threats of worse torture if he spoke to anyone about what had happened. "Why didn't you go to the police immediately?" the prosecutor asked. "Because I was terrified," Colston answered simply. "They said they'd kill me and my family, and I believed them. I'd seen what they could do." Other victims testified with similar stories. The details varied, but the pattern was consistent. Accusations in a kangaroo court, systematic torture using multiple methods, threats to ensure silence. Some victims had lost teeth. Others had fingers or toes removed with bolt cutters. Several described electrical torture, the generator operated by Roy Hall, the electrodes attached to their genitals or other sensitive areas. The testimony was often difficult to hear. Some witnesses broke down on the stand, overwhelmed by having to relive their trauma in a public courtroom. Others were stoic, determined to ensure that their suffering wasn't in vain, that the men who had tortured them would face justice. The defense attorneys, skilled and expensive lawyers hired by Richardson money, did their best to discredit the witnesses. They pointed out that many of the victims were criminals themselves, suggesting that their testimony was unreliable. They noted inconsistencies in some accounts, arguing that this proved the stories were fabricated. They suggested that victims had been promised immunity from prosecution in exchange for their testimony and were therefore motivated to lie. But the sheer number of victims, the consistency of the overall pattern, and the physical evidence of injuries made the defense's job difficult. Yes, some victims were criminals. Yes, some had received immunity. But their stories fit together too well, described the same locations and methods, and included details that couldn't have been coordinated if the testimony were fabricated. Johnny Bradbury's testimony was particularly damaging. As an insider who had participated in the gang's activities, he could describe the organization's structure, the decision-making process, who gave orders and who carried them out. He testified about specific torture sessions, identifying which gang members had participated in each. He described the fraud schemes, the international operations, the corruption of police officers. The defense attorneys tore into Bradbury, pointing out that he was testifying to save himself from the hangman's noose in South Africa. They suggested he would say anything to secure his freedom, But Bradbury's testimony included details that could be corroborated through other evidence, times, places, specific injuries that matched medical records. While his motives for testifying were certainly self-interested, his information appeared to be accurate. The trial lasted for weeks, with testimony day after day describing a criminal empire built on systematic brutality. The British public, following the case through newspaper reports, was simultaneously fascinated and horrified. This wasn't the glamorous gangster life portrayed in films. This was sadism and torture, carried out methodically by men who seemed to have no conscience whatsoever. Charlie Richardson's defense was simple, complete denial. He was a legitimate businessman, he claimed. The scrapyards were legal operations. Yes, he knew some of the other defendants, but he wasn't responsible for their actions. The victims were criminals with grudges, or they were lying to receive immunity from prosecution. He had never tortured anyone, never ordered anyone tortured, and had no knowledge of any torture occurring. His testimony was calm and measured. He presented himself as a man more sinned against than sinning, a successful businessman targeted by jealous competitors and lying criminals. He denied knowledge of specific incidents, suggested that any violence that occurred was without his knowledge or approval, and maintained throughout that he was innocent of all charges. But the prosecution methodically dismantled this defense. They showed how Richardson controlled the gang, how orders flowed from him to other members. They demonstrated his presence at the scrapyard, where torture occurred. They presented evidence that he had profited from the fraud and protection operations. Most damagingly, they had witnesses who testified to hearing Richardson directly order torture or threaten people with torture. Eddie Richardson's defense was similarly based on denial, but was even less convincing than his brother's. Multiple witnesses placed Eddie at torture sessions, described him participating in violence, heard him make threats. His injury from the Mr. Smith's shootout, which resulted in additional charges, further complicated his defense. Frankie Fraser made no real attempt to deny his involvement in violence. His defense was essentially that he was just muscle, following orders, not a decision-maker in the organization. This strategy had some logic. If the jury believed Fraser was just an enforcer carrying out orders, they might give him a lighter sentence than the gang leaders. But Fraser's reputation and the testimony about his enthusiastic participation in torture made this a difficult sell. The trial's conclusion came after weeks of testimony and deliberation. Justice Lawton's summation to the jury was clear and forceful. He explained the legal standards they needed to apply, the burden of proof required for conviction. But he also made clear his own views on the credibility of the testimony they had heard. You have heard testimony rarely, if ever, heard in an English court of law, he told the jury. You have heard descriptions of systematic torture, of brutality that shocks the conscience. You must decide, based on the evidence, whether you believe these crimes occurred and whether the defendants before you are responsible. The jury retired to deliberate. In the courtroom and across Britain, people waited to see if the torture gang would finally face justice for their crimes. The verdict, when it came, was decisive and comprehensive. Guilty. Charlie Richardson was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 25 years in prison, an extraordinarily long sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the judge's determination to send a message that such brutality would not be tolerated. Eddie Richardson received 10 years for his role in the torture gang, with an additional 5 years for his involvement in the Mr. Smith's shootout. His total sentence of 15 years meant he would spend much of his remaining youth behind bars. Frankie Fraser received 10 years for his role in the torture sessions, including what the judge famously termed deviant dental practices, a reference to his role in extracting victims' teeth with pliers during torture sessions. The phrase deviant dental practices would become darkly famous, a piece of judicial understatement that captured the horror of Fraser's crimes while maintaining the formal language of legal proceedings. The other gang members received varying sentences based on their roles and the evidence against them. Some received relatively light sentences for minor roles. Others faced substantial prison time for their participation in the gang's activities. The public reaction to the verdicts was overwhelmingly positive. After weeks of hearing about torture, corruption, and brutality, the British public was relieved to see justice done. The sentences were harsh, but most people felt they were appropriate given the crimes. The torture gang had terrorized South London for years. Now they would spend years in prison paying for those crimes. The trial's impact extended beyond the specific convictions. The extensive testimony about police corruption led to investigations and reforms within the Metropolitan Police. Dozens of officers were dismissed or forced to resign. New oversight mechanisms were put in place to prevent the kind of corruption that had allowed the Richardson Gang to operate with impunity for so long. The trial also marked a turning point in British attitudes toward organized crime. The glamorization of gangsters that had characterized some coverage of the Kray twins was suddenly much less appealing when confronted with the reality of torture chambers and systematic brutality. The Richardson trial showed the true face of organized crime, not glamorous or exciting, but vicious and degrading for the victims who had testified. The verdicts brought a measure of closure. They had lived in fear for years, terrorized into silence. Convinced that the Richardson Gang was untouchable, now they had stood in open court, told their stories, and seen their torturers convicted and sentenced. Justice had been delayed, but it had ultimately been served. As Charlie Richardson was led from the dock to begin his 25-year sentence, he maintained his composure. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused. To the end, he presented himself as a businessman wrongly convicted, a victim of a justice system that had failed him, but the evidence said otherwise. The torture gang had been real, the crimes had been committed, and now punishment had been delivered. The empire built on pain and fear had fallen, and its architect would spend the next 2.5 decades behind bars. Charlie Richardson entered prison in 1967 as a convicted gangster, a man found guilty of crimes that had shocked the nation. At 33 years old, he faced the prospect of spending the next 25 years behind bars, a quarter century that would transform him from a relatively young man in his prime to someone approaching 60, having lost the most productive years of his life to incarceration. The British prison system in the late 1960s and 1970s was harsh, particularly for high-profile criminals like Richardson. He was classified as a maximum security prisoner, someone who posed a significant risk of escape and who needed to be kept isolated from opportunities to continue directing criminal activities from inside prison. This meant he would be held in some of Britain's toughest prisons, with limited privileges and constant surveillance. Richardson's first years in prison were reportedly the most difficult. The adjustment from being a powerful gang leader who controlled a criminal empire to being just another prisoner taking orders from guards was psychologically devastating. For a man who had built his identity around power and control, the complete loss of both was traumatic. But Charlie Richardson was nothing if not resilient. He had survived poverty, war, and the brutal world of criminal enterprises. He would survive prison too, though survival would require adapting to a very different environment. Prison life for Richardson meant strict routines, wake-up calls at dawn, regimented mealtimes, limited recreation periods, long hours in a cell with minimal stimulation. For a man whose life had been characterized by activity and decision-making, the enforced passivity was maddening, but Richardson learned to adapt, finding ways to maintain his sense of identity and purpose within the constraints of prison. One adaptation was intellectual. Richardson used his time in prison to read extensively. educating himself in subjects he'd never had time for during his criminal career. He read history, philosophy, current affairs. He became, in his own way, a scholar of sorts, using his considerable intelligence in ways that weren't possible when all his energy was focused on criminal operations. He also maintained connections with the outside world through correspondence. Letter writing became a crucial link to his former life, allowing him to stay informed about developments in South London, maintain relationships with family, and perhaps most interestingly, correspond with other famous criminals. Among Richardson's correspondents was Reggie Kray, one of the twin brothers who had been his rivals in the criminal underworld. Both men were now serving long sentences for their crimes. The Krays had been convicted in 1969 for murder and other offenses. The correspondence between Richardson and Reggie Kray, particularly their exchange of Christmas cards, represents a fascinating footnote in British criminal history. Two men who had been gang rivals, whose organizations had nearly gone to war, were now both imprisoned and finding common ground in their shared experience of long-term incarceration. Their letters reportedly discussed prison conditions, legal appeals, and reflections on their past lives. The rivalry that had characterized their relationship on the outside seemed to fade in prison, replaced by a kind of professional respect between criminals who had reached similar positions of power through similar methods. Eddie, Richardson's relationship with Charlie Kray, the older Kray brother who was less famous than the twins, while both were incarcerated at Whitemoor Prison, provided another connection between the two gang families. Eddie and Charlie Kray developed a cordial relationship, united by their experiences as siblings of more notorious brothers, as men caught up in the criminal world, but perhaps not as central to it as others. These connections between Richardson and Kray gang members in prison highlight how the traditional rivalries of the criminal underworld often don't survive incarceration. In prison, the relevant division wasn't between East End and South London gangs. It was between inmates and guards, between those with power and those without. Richardson and the Krays had more in common with each other than with the people who now controlled their lives. Throughout the 1970s, Richardson made multiple attempts to secure early release. He hired lawyers to appeal his conviction and sentence, arguing that the evidence had been insufficient, that the sentence was too harsh, that he had been rehabilitated. Each appeal was denied. The British justice system, having finally brought the torture gang to justice, was not about to release its leader prematurely. But in 1980, Charlie Richardson made a decision that would become one of the most bizarre episodes in British criminal history. He escaped from prison. Richardson had been transferred to an open prison, a facility with lower security designed for prisoners approaching release who were deemed low escape risks. This transfer was itself somewhat surprising given Richardson's history, but prison officials apparently believed that after 13 years of incarceration, Richardson was no longer a significant risk. They were wrong. In 1980, Charlie Richardson walked away from the open prison and disappeared. For nearly a year, one of Britain's most notorious gangsters was on the run, evading one of the most extensive manhunts in British criminal history. The escape was an embarrassment for the prison system and a sensation in the press. How had Richardson managed to escape? Where was he hiding? Was he still in Britain, or had he fled abroad? What makes Richardson's time as a fugitive particularly memorable was how he chose to use it. Rather than simply hiding and enjoying freedom, Richardson embarked on a publicity campaign to argue for his early release. And he chose to do this in the most theatrical way possible, by dressing as Father Christmas. In December 1980, with Christmas approaching, Charlie Richardson appeared in public dressed in a full Santa Claus costume, complete with white beard, red suit, and bag of presents. He distributed gifts to children in working-class neighborhoods, apparently attempting to position himself as a Robin Hood figure, a man from the community. who had been unjustly imprisoned and who wanted to give back to the people. The image of one of Britain's most brutal gangsters, a man convicted of systematic torture, dressed as Santa Claus and handing out presents to children, was surreal. The press had a field day with it, running photos of Santa Charlie alongside reminders of his actual crimes. The public reaction was mixed. Some people seemed to find the whole thing amusing, while others were outraged that Richardson was making a mockery of his escape. Richardson also used his time on the run to communicate with journalists, giving interviews where he proclaimed his innocence and argued that he deserved to be released. He claimed that he had been a legitimate businessman wrongly convicted by lying witnesses. He suggested that he had been targeted because of his success, that jealous competitors and corrupt officials had conspired against him. These claims were, of course, contradicted by the overwhelming evidence that had been presented at his trial. But Richardson was skilled at public relations, and he managed to generate some sympathetic coverage, particularly in tabloid newspapers that were more interested in sensational stories than in accurate representations of his crimes. The manhunt for Richardson intensified as his publicity stunts became more brazen. Police were embarrassed that he had remained free for so long and were determined to recapture him. Tips and sightings poured in from across Britain, though many were false leads from people who thought they might have seen him. After 11 months on the run, Charlie Richardson was finally captured in July 1981. The exact circumstances of his capture remain somewhat unclear. Different accounts give different versions. What is certain is that he was returned to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence, with additional time added for the escape itself. The escape and subsequent capture had accomplished nothing concrete for Richardson. He was back in prison, his sentence was longer, and he had lost whatever privileges he might have earned through good behavior. But in another sense, the escape had been successful. It had reminded the public that Charlie Richardson still existed, had generated publicity that kept his name in the news, and had demonstrated that even in his mid-40s, and after more than a decade in prison, he was still capable of bold action. The remaining years of Richardson's sentence were less eventful. He was now back in maximum security facilities, closely watched to prevent another escape attempt. He continued his reading and correspondence, maintained contact with family, and began to reflect more deeply on his life and crimes. Prison also gave Richardson time to observe how the criminal world had changed during his incarceration. The London he had dominated in the 1960s no longer existed. The gang wars that had characterized that era had ended, with both the Richardson and Kray organizations destroyed by prosecution. A new generation of criminals had emerged, with different methods and different priorities. The sophisticated fraud operations that Richardson had pioneered were now common. International criminal connections that had seemed exotic in the 1960s were routine by the 1980s. The criminal underworld had evolved, and Richardson's methods, the torture, the territorial control, the public violence, seemed almost antiquated in comparison. There was also a demographic change in British crime. The traditional white working-class gangsters like Richardson were being replaced or supplemented by criminals from immigrant communities, particularly from Jamaica and other Commonwealth countries. These new criminals brought different cultural approaches to crime, different structures, different methods. The criminal landscape was changing, and there was less and less place for old-school gangsters like Charlie Richardson. As Richardson approached his potential release date in the mid-1980s, he began preparing for life after prison. He would be released as an older man into a world that had changed dramatically during his incarceration. The South London of the 1960s was gone, replaced by something very different. His old gang was dispersed, some members still in prison, others dead, a few trying to live quiet lives and avoid attention. Richardson also faced the reality that he would be released with very little. His criminal empire had been dismantled, Assets had been seized or had disappeared. The money he'd made through years of crime was gone. He would be starting over at an age when most people were approaching retirement, trying to build a new life with a criminal record that would make employment difficult. But he would also be free, and after 17 years in prison, freedom itself was an enormous prize. July 1984, Charlie Richardson walked out of prison at age 50, having served 17 years of his 25-year sentence. The world he re-entered was radically different from the one he'd left in 1967. Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. Britain was in the midst of major social and economic changes, and the London he had known and dominated was almost unrecognizable. The immediate adjustment to freedom was difficult. After nearly 2 decades of regimented prison life, making even simple decisions felt overwhelming. What to eat, what to wear, where to go. These basic choices, which he'd been denied for years, now required mental effort. The sensory experience of freedom was also jarring. The noise of traffic, crowds of people, the sheer variety of sights and sounds after years of prison monotony. Richardson had served his time, but he was not warmly welcomed back into society. His crimes had been too notorious, too brutal for people to forget. He was a celebrity of sorts, but a dark celebrity. Someone famous for terrible things. People recognized him on the street, and their reactions ranged from curiosity to revulsion to fear. His family relationships had suffered during his imprisonment. His children had grown up while he was in prison. Not a good father, but he was a father, his brother Eddie would later say, capturing the complicated reality of Richardson's family life. He had provided financially for his family through his criminal activities, but he had been absent during crucial years of his children's development. First because of his criminal activities, and then because of his incarceration. The London Richardson returned to was economically very different from the one he'd left. Thatcher's free market policies had transformed the economy, creating new opportunities for some, but leaving others behind. The working class communities Richardson had come from were changing, with traditional industries declining and being replaced by service economies. South London itself had changed dramatically. The scrapyard where torture had occurred was long gone. Mr. Smith's club, site of the fatal shootout, was now just a normal shop, with no indication of the violence that had occurred there. The pubs and clubs where Richardson had once held court had new owners, new clientele, or had closed entirely. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. Charlie Richardson, now in his 50s and having spent nearly 2 decades reflecting on his life, had developed perspectives that differed from the young gangster he'd been. In interviews after his release, Richardson presented himself as reformed, as someone who regretted the pain he'd caused and who wanted to make amends. How sincere this reformation was remains debatable. Some observers believed Richardson had genuinely changed, that years in prison had given him perspective and empathy he'd lacked as a young criminal. Others believed he was simply saying what he needed to say, presenting a reformed image because it served his interests. What is certain is that Richardson became involved in work with young offenders, speaking to at-risk youth about the realities of crime and incarceration. This represented a complete reversal from his earlier life. The man who had once recruited young criminals into his gang was now trying to steer young people away from crime. These speaking engagements allowed Richardson to present his life story as a cautionary tale. He would describe his childhood in poverty, his early success in business, his descent into crime, the violence and torture, and finally the long years in prison. The message was clear. Crime doesn't pay, violence destroys lives, and the glamorous gangster life is a lie that ends in prison or death. Whether this work with young offenders was genuinely altruistic or simply another performance by a skilled manipulator is unclear. Richardson was intelligent enough to recognize that presenting himself as reformed was beneficial. It generated some positive publicity, potentially reduced animosity from those he'd victimized, and provided him with a role and identity beyond notorious gangster. But Richardson also began working on his autobiography, a project that would consume much of his remaining years. He wanted to tell his story, to provide his perspective on the events that had made him famous and infamous. The autobiography, eventually titled The Last Gangster, My Final Confession, would be his attempt to shape how history remembered him. The writing of the autobiography was itself revealing. Richardson worked on it for years, revising and refining his account. He knew that this book would be his final statement, his last opportunity to present his version of events. He approached it with the same calculation and attention to detail that had characterized his criminal operations. The book, which was finished just weeks before his death in 2012, contained revelations about royalty, phone hacking, bent coppers, and what Richardson called his infamous black box of secrets. These teases suggested that Richardson had information about powerful people and significant events that he had kept secret for decades. How much of this was true, and how much was Richardson attempting to magnify his own importance, is unclear. He had certainly operated at a level of sophistication unusual for British criminals of his era, and his connections had extended into business, politics, and even intelligence agencies. It's plausible that he did possess secrets that powerful people would prefer remained hidden. But Richardson also had a lifelong tendency to exaggerate his own importance and influence. He had always seen himself as a businessman and strategist rather than simply a criminal, and in his autobiography, he attempted to portray himself as someone who had operated at the highest levels of society, someone whose knowledge and connections made him dangerous even in old age. The autobiography also revealed Richardson's perspective on his crimes. He expressed some regret for the violence, but often framed it as necessary for business, as the unfortunate cost of building and maintaining his empire. He portrayed himself as someone who had been operating in a brutal world, where violence was simply part of how business was conducted. This attempt to contextualize and partially justify his crimes is common among career criminals writing autobiographies. They want to tell their stories, but also want to be seen as more than simply brutal thugs. Richardson wanted to be remembered as an intelligent businessman who happened to operate outside the law, not as a sadistic torturer. As Richardson aged, his health began to decline. A lifetime of heavy smoking caught up with him, and he developed emphysema, a chronic lung disease that progressively makes breathing more difficult. The disease is degenerative, and Richardson's condition worsened over his final years. By 2012, Richardson was 78 years old, in failing health and aware that his time was limited. He rushed to complete his autobiography, wanting to ensure that his version of his story would be told before he died. He included revelations and hints about secrets, perhaps hoping to ensure that his name would remain relevant even after his death. The emphysema that would ultimately contribute to his death was a fitting end in some ways. Richardson had always been a heavy smoker, and like many of his generation, had ignored or dismissed health warnings about smoking. Now, at the end of his life, that choice was literally making it harder for him to breathe. But even as his health failed, Richardson maintained the persona he'd cultivated, the intelligent businessman, the reformed criminal, the man with secrets. To the end, he was performing, managing his image, trying to control how the world saw him. His relationship with his brother Eddie remained important throughout his later years. Eddie had been released from prison earlier than Charlie and had built a new life for himself. The brothers' bond, forged in childhood poverty and strengthened through their criminal years and imprisonment, remained strong. Eddie Richardson's life after prison provides an interesting contrast to Charlie's. Eddie became somewhat of a celebrity in his own right. giving talks and interviews about his criminal past, selling his story to those willing to pay for an evening with a genuine gangster for £300. People could have lunch with Eddie Richardson and hear first-hand accounts of the gang's exploits. This commodification of criminality is itself interesting. Eddie Richardson had served his time, paid his debt to society, and was now making money from his notoriety. He was open about his past, admitting in interviews, "I wouldn't want to meet myself now as I was then." This self-awareness, this acknowledgement that his younger self had been dangerous and harmful, suggested at least some genuine reflection on his life choices. The Richardson brothers' later years highlight how society deals with reformed criminals. They had committed terrible crimes, served their sentences, and were now free. Should they be forever defined by their worst actions? Could they genuinely reform? And if they had reformed, what roles should they play in society? These questions don't have easy answers. Charlie Richardson's work with young offenders might have genuinely helped prevent some youth from entering criminal life. But he was also profiting from his notoriety, trading on the fame that came from torture and violence. The contradiction was impossible to resolve. As Richardson entered his final years, he must have reflected on what his life had amounted to. He had risen from poverty to power, building a criminal empire that dominated South London. He had lived well, driven expensive cars, wielded enormous power. But he had also spent 17 years in prison, lost his prime years, destroyed lives through torture and violence, and would die known primarily for brutality rather than success. The legacy question haunted Richardson's final years. How would history remember him? What would people think when they heard his name decades or centuries from now? He had tried to shape that legacy through his autobiography, through his work with young offenders, through interviews and public appearances. But he knew that the torture would always be central to his story, that he would always be remembered as the torture gang boss. In September 2012, Charlie Richardson's failing health took a final turn. He was admitted to hospital suffering from peritonitis, an inflammation of the abdominal lining that can be fatal, particularly in someone already weakened by emphysema and age. On September 19, 2012, Charlie Richardson died at age 78, bringing to a close one of the most notorious criminal lives in British history. The death of Charlie Richardson on September 19, 2012, marked the end of a life that had encompassed poverty, power, brutality, imprisonment, and a complex attempt at redemption. His brother Eddie confirmed the death, adding the epitaph that captured the complicated relationship between the Richardson brothers and their families. "I can't say he was a good father, but he was a father. He leaves a big family behind him." That statement, loaded with ambiguity, spoke volumes about Charlie Richardson's life. He had been present but absent, providing but not nurturing. A father in the biological sense, but often failing in the emotional and moral sense. His criminal career had provided for his family financially, but had also resulted in his long absence during imprisonment, leaving his children to grow up without a father during crucial years. The news of Richardson's death generated significant media coverage. Newspapers ran obituaries that detailed his life, from his working-class childhood through his criminal empire and eventual imprisonment. The coverage was neither wholly condemnatory nor celebratory. Richardson had been too complex a figure, his crimes too serious, his later attempts at reform too ambiguous for simple narratives. Bobby Cummins, a reformed bank robber who had turned his life around and received an OBE for his work with ex-offenders, provided perhaps the most balanced assessment. Whatever anyone says, he paid for his crimes. This statement acknowledged both the severity of Richardson's crimes and the fact that he had served a substantial prison sentence. Richardson had done terrible things, but he had also served his time according to British law. The media obituaries inevitably compared Richardson to the Kray twins, his East End rivals who had achieved far greater lasting fame. The Krays had been the subject of multiple films, countless books, and had become cultural icons of a sort, glamorized gangsters, representing a mythologized version of East End working-class culture. Richardson, despite being arguably more brutal and sophisticated in his criminal operations, had remained a more obscure figure. This difference in public perception is itself interesting. Why did the Krays achieve cultural immortality while Richardson remained relatively forgotten? Part of the answer lies in their different approaches to publicity. The Krays courted fame, wanted to be celebrities, cultivated relationships with actors and politicians. Richardson avoided publicity, preferring to work in shadows. The Krays' crimes, while certainly brutal, were often quick shootings, stabbings, violence that was explosive but brief. Richardson's torture methods were prolonged and systematic, harder for the public to romanticize or incorporate into gangster mythology. It's easier to make a glamorous film about gangsters who shoot their enemies than about gangsters who torture people with pliers and electric shocks for hours. The Krays also had the advantage of identical twins, a natural hook for storytelling that Richardson lacked. Two brothers who looked identical, who were inseparable, who committed crimes together. This was inherently more narratively compelling than Charlie and Eddie Richardson, who were simply siblings working together. But perhaps most importantly, the Krays died in prison, maintaining their gangster credentials to the end. Richardson was released, tried to reform, worked with young offenders, wrote an autobiography expressing some regret. This complicated legacy made him a less clean narrative than the Krays, who could be frozen in time as forever gangsters, never having to deal with the messy realities of aging, reform, or reflection. Eddie Richardson, still alive at the time of Charlie's death and for years after, represented the living legacy of the Richardson Gang. By the time Charlie died, Eddie had become something of a professional ex-gangster, giving interviews, appearing at events, and yes, offering those 300-pound lunches where people could hear his stories firsthand. Eddie's admission, "I wouldn't want to meet myself now as I was then," represents a type of self-awareness that Charlie rarely demonstrated publicly. Eddie acknowledged that his younger self had been dangerous, that the violence and criminality were real and harmful, not glamorous adventures to be celebrated. This honesty, combined with his willingness to discuss his past openly, made Eddie a more sympathetic figure than his brother had been. The houses allegedly built with Richardson money still stand in various parts of South London, silent monuments to a criminal empire. The property investments that Charlie had used to launder his criminal proceeds had become legitimate assets over time, owned by people who may or may not know the origins of the buildings they live in. The physical infrastructure of the Richardson Empire outlasted the gang itself in Upton, Norfolk, the village that had hosted the gang's bolt hole at the White Horse pub. Older residents remembered the days when dangerous men from London would arrive for secretive meetings. The pub itself had long since lost any connection to the Richardson Gang, becoming just another village pub with no indication of its criminal history. But local folklore kept the stories alive, tales of the gangsters who had used their quiet village as a refuge. The impact of the Richardson Gang on South London was profound and lasting. Though not always in obvious ways, the torture and violence had created a generation of victims, people who carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Benny Cowlston and others, who had been tortured, never fully recovered, living with trauma, missing teeth and digits, and memories of horror that never quite faded. The gang's activities had also contributed to significant reforms in British policing. The revelation of how extensively the Metropolitan Police had been corrupted by criminal organizations led to substantial changes in how police forces were structured and supervised. The idea that up to 70% of the seed might need to be replaced was shocking, but it led to real reforms that made such extensive corruption less likely in future generations. The Richardson case also influenced British legal thinking about organized crime. The prosecution had faced significant challenges in building their case. How do you prove systematic criminality when most of it occurs in secret? When victims are too terrified to speak? When physical evidence is carefully disposed of? The eventual success of the prosecution provided a template for future cases against organized crime, demonstrating that conviction was possible even without traditional evidence if witness testimony could be secured and corroborated. From a historical perspective, the Richardson Gang represents a particular moment in British criminal history. They operated during a transitional period when British crime was evolving from local protection rackets and simple theft toward more sophisticated fraud, international operations, and systematic violence. Charlie Richardson was ahead of his time in many ways. His international connections, his fraud schemes, his understanding of how to use legitimate business to cover illegal activities. But he was also very much a product of his time, a working-class boy from wartime London, who saw crime as a route out of poverty, who built his empire through personal relationships and face-to-face intimidation, who operated in a world where corruption was endemic and violence was accepted as part of business. The criminal world he knew was already disappearing by the time he went to prison, replaced by something more impersonal, more technological, more global. The question of whether Charlie Richardson was a businessman or a psychopath is ultimately unanswerable because he was undoubtedly both. He possessed genuine business intelligence. His ability to build multiple successful scrapyards by age 22, to develop sophisticated fraud schemes, to create international connections, all demonstrate real acumen. But his willingness to inflict prolonged torture on people, his apparent lack of empathy for victim suffering, his cold calculation in using violence to build power, these suggest psychopathic traits. Perhaps the most accurate assessment is that Richardson was a brilliant businessman who lacked the moral constraints that keep most intelligent people from becoming monsters. He saw opportunities that others missed, but he was willing to do things that others found unconscionable. His intelligence made him more dangerous, not less, because he applied it systematically to criminal activities. The human cost of Richardson's criminal career is incalculable. Beyond the direct victims of torture, beyond the people defrauded, beyond the businesses destroyed by protection rackets, there were ripple effects throughout South London. Children grew up in neighborhoods terrorized by gang violence. Honest police officers became cynical, seeing their corrupt colleagues profit from criminal relationships. Community bonds were weakened by fear and suspicion. Dickie Hart, killed in the shootout at Mr. Smith's club, left behind a family. Harry Rawlings, shot during that same incident, carried the physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. Benny Colston's missing teeth were permanent reminders of his torture. Johnny Bradbury, who betrayed the gang to save his own life, had to live with being known as an informant. One of the worst labels in criminal culture. The victims extend far beyond those who testified at trial. Yet there's also a strange human element to Richardson's story. His loyalty to his brother Eddie was genuine and lasting. His letters to Reggie Kray showed a capacity for connection, even with former rivals. His later work with young offenders, whatever its motivations, might have genuinely helped some youth avoid the criminal path. He was not simply a monster. He was a human being who did monstrous things, which is somehow more disturbing than simple evil would be. The Richardson Gang's place in criminal history is secure. If not as prominent as the Krays, they were the torture gang. The sophisticated criminals who combined business intelligence with systematic brutality. The South London empire that fell on the day England won the World Cup. Students of criminal history will always know the name, even if the broader public has largely forgotten. What's particularly interesting is how quickly the gang's story moved from current events to history to myth. Within a few years of their conviction, the Richardson Gang was already being mythologized, with stories growing in the telling. Some tales were exaggerated. The torture had been terrible enough without embellishment. But human nature leads to exaggeration. Other stories were sanitized, with the gang portrayed as Robin Hood figures fighting against corrupt police and oppressive authorities. This mythologization is common with criminal figures. But it's particularly notable with the Richardson Gang because Charlie himself participated in it. Through his autobiography and interviews, he was trying to shape his own mythology, to present himself as he wanted to be remembered rather than as he actually was. The tension between Richardson's self-presentation and the high, historical reality is one of the most interesting aspects of his legacy. The question of secrets, the infamous black box that Richardson claimed to possess, remains intriguing. Did he actually have compromising information about royalty, politicians, and intelligence agencies? Or was this simply an elderly gangster trying to inflate his importance, suggesting connections and knowledge he didn't actually possess? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Richardson certainly had connections that extended beyond typical criminal networks. His South African operations, his alleged involvement in phone tapping, his corruption of police officers, all of this suggests he operated at a level where he might have acquired sensitive information. But whether this information was as significant as he claimed, and whether it remained relevant decades later, is questionable. In death, as in life, Charlie Richardson remained an enigma. The man who walked out of prison in 1984, claiming reform while also hinting at dark secrets. The gangster who tortured people, but also spoke to school children about avoiding crime. The businessman who built a legitimate scrap metal empire, but used it to cover systematic criminality. The father who provided for his family, but was absent during crucial years. The criminal who served his time, but never quite admitted the full extent of his crimes. When the final accounting is done, what is Charlie Richardson's legacy? He demonstrated that intelligence and business acumen, when applied to criminal activity without moral constraints, can create enormously powerful criminal organizations. He showed that corruption can extend deep into institutions we rely on for security and justice. He proved that even the most feared criminals can eventually be brought to justice, though it may take extraordinary efforts and some luck. But perhaps his most lasting legacy is serving as a cautionary tale. The empire he built collapsed. The power he wielded disappeared. The money he made was lost. The respect he commanded turned to fear and then to infamy. He spent 17 years in prison, and his final years as a notorious figure remembered primarily for brutality. The glamorous gangster life he might have imagined as a young man turned out to be a lie that ended in loss, imprisonment, and a complicated death surrounded by questions about whether he'd ever genuinely understood or regretted the harm he'd caused. Today, if you walk through Camberwell or Catford, you'll find little trace of the Richardson empire. The neighborhood has changed, gentrified in some areas, remained working class in others. New generations have grown up with no memory of when the Richardson Gang ruled through fear. The scrapyard torture chamber is long gone, replaced by some other business or development. Mr. Smith's club is just a shop, unremarkable and unmemorable. But in the pubs of South London, if you find the right old-timers, the stories still circulate. Stories about when you didn't cross the Richardsons, when a call to Charlie's office could mean torture or death, when the torture gang ruled South London and seemed untouchable. The stories are fewer now, the tellers older and fewer with each passing year. Eventually, even these oral histories will fade, leaving only the written record, trial transcripts, newspaper articles, histories, and Charlie's own autobiography. The past is never really gone. As the saying goes, It's just sleeping. The Richardson Gang's reign of terror ended more than half a century ago, but its echoes remain. In the reformed policing practices that emerged from the corruption scandal, in the victims who carried their scars to their graves, in the cautionary tale of how intelligence without conscience creates monsters, in the reminder that even the most powerful criminals eventually face justice. Even if that justice is delayed, Charlie Richardson died at 78, having lived far longer than many of his victims and associates. He saw his empire rise and fall. He experienced power and powerlessness. He spent years in prison and years free. He was feared and eventually forgotten by most. He tried to shape his legacy and failed to fully control it, as we all ultimately fail to control how history remembers us. The final word might belong to Eddie Richardson, Charlie's brother and partner in crime, who outlived him and continued selling stories about their criminal past. Eddie's reflection that he wouldn't want to meet his younger self suggests that somewhere in the journey from feared gangster to elderly man selling lunch dates, genuine self-awareness had emerged. Whether Charlie achieved similar awareness before his death remains unclear. What is clear is that the torture gang's story, like all true crime stories, is ultimately a human story. It's about poverty and ambition, violence and power, loyalty and betrayal, justice delayed and eventually served. It's about how ordinary circumstances, a childhood in wartime London, a father's abandonment, the opportunities of the scrap metal trade can combine with particular personalities to create extraordinary evil. Charlie Richardson was born in Brentford in 1934, grew up in Camberwell, built an empire of pain in South London, was arrested on England's greatest day, served 17 years in prison, and died in 2012, leaving behind a complicated legacy of business success and brutal criminality. His story is complete, his crimes punished, his victims remembered by those who knew them, his name fading from public consciousness but preserved in the historical record. The scrap metal dealer who became the torture gang boss, the businessman who became a criminal legend, the prisoner who escaped dressed as Santa Claus, the elderly man who hinted at secrets he'd never fully reveal. All of these Charlie Richardsons existed, and all of them died in September 2012, taking their full truth to the grave. And so ends the story of Charlie Richardson, a man who built an empire of fear and pain, who terrorized South London for years, who was finally brought to justice, who served his time, who tried and perhaps failed to truly reform, and who died as he had lived, a figure of controversy, complexity, and enduring dark fascination. His reign of terror is over, relegated to history, but the lessons from his story remain relevant for anyone seeking to understand the nature of criminal power, the importance of justice, and the ultimate futility of building empires on foundations of pain. The past may be sleeping, but while the written record remains, it can always be awakened. Charlie Richardson's story is complete, but it will continue to be told, studied, and contemplated as long as people remain interested in the dark corners of human nature and the criminal underworld that flourishes in society's shadows. His was a life of contradictions, brilliant and brutal, successful and ultimately failed, feared and eventually pitied, in death as in life. Charlie Richardson remains a figure who defies simple categorization, a reminder that real human evil is complex, that criminals are people, and that justice, however delayed, can eventually be served. And so ends the story of Charlie Richardson, the scrap metal dealer who built an empire of fear, the gangster who tortured with pliers and electric shocks, the man arrested on England's finest day, and the prisoner who escaped dressed as Santa Claus. He died at 78, having served 17 years for crimes that terrorized an entire city. Unlike the Krays, Charlie never achieved lasting fame. No major Hollywood films, no celebrity worship. Perhaps that's fitting for a man who worked in shadows, whose power came not from publicity, but from the knowledge that crossing him meant unimaginable pain. If you made it to the end of this deep dive, I truly appreciate you. This is the kind of thorough, detailed storytelling that takes hours to research and create. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps me create more content like this. Subscribe if you want more long-form gangster documentaries. I've got stories about the Krays, the Quarterman Gang, the Birmingham Gang, and more coming soon. Drop a comment and let me know. Did Charlie Richardson deserve 25 years? Was he a businessman who went too far? Or a sadistic psychopath? And most importantly, do you think the Richardsons were more dangerous than the Krays? Thanks for watching, and remember, the past is never really gone. It's just sleeping until next time.